and welcome to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and your breath smells great. What kind of industrial-grade mouthwash do you use? Because I want some of that. I am increasingly interested not in what people think, but in how they think. And when we think of history, particularly here in the United States, we tend to view it as a straight line. Picture a railroad from the colonies to the Industrial Revolution to modern society to Star Trek. It's this kind of progressive build from one stage to another. Or maybe it's more like a roller coaster, but that's still a straight line, or at least it's an A-B track, right? But there's a much older way of looking at how history unfolds that's not linear. That's to think of it as cyclical. In that way of thinking, history is more like seasons, and those seasons repeat. In a moment, I'm going to bring on Neil Howe to talk about generational theory and the idea that America has 4 types of generations which keep repeating. And incidentally, the term my generation has, millennial, was coined by Mr. Howe. But first, Something's Off with Andrew Heaton is brought to you by meat bullets, the quickest, deadliest way to deliver meat in a straight line, period.
When you need beef for to shoot a thief, meat bullets. Delicious protein that's straight and lean ammunition you can eat. It's a high-speed chow, it's a weaponized cow, meat bullets. Shoots through the air, high velocity fair, it's bullets you can eat. Cooked well done, shot from a gun in a slug or buckshot kind. Plan your attack with a sumptuous snack, meat bullets. Your gun will propel at that edible pellet, it's swiftly moving beef. Accurate but sweet, it's a tasty treat, meat bullets. With a pretty good aim, you can blast some game with projectiles you can eat. You just can't beat some cone-shaped meat for supper. Get the job done with meat from a gun, it's accelerated beef. Deadly meat as an aperitif, well meal and round combined. Now the FDA's got a bit to say, meat bullets. Snack or defense, use a little common sense, don't shoot it in your mouth. We lost some loot from a class action shoot, meat bullets. Make sure you don't wait past the expiration date, cause E. coli isn't fun. So be sure to purchase meat bullets, meat bullets, meat bullets. They're great.
Meat bullets from Delicious Munitions. For fast snacks, we've got you covered. Ready, aim, eat. My guest today is Neil Howe. He is a historian and demographer. He's the author of a bunch of books, but the ones that we're principally going to talk about today is The Fourth Turning, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. Mr. Howe, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
So I think the book is incredibly thought-provoking. I really enjoyed reading it. It gave me not just an interesting overview of the American experience, but you pull in a lot of classical antiquity and history into it as well. And I kind of want to start big and then focus in on kind of the structure of your theory, and then from there get to where we are in modern society and how we plug into it. But to kick it off, can you kind of tell me the differences between thinking in a linear capacity in history versus thinking in a cyclical capacity?
Well, you know, it's interesting. In the ancient world, before modernity, the only way people thought about time was cyclically. In other words, time just repeated. In fact, our very words for time has to do with cycles, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, the most accurate clock we now have for measuring time is actually looking at the vibrations of atoms, you know, when you kind of heat them up. But the word time itself comes from tide, you know, which repeats, mm-hmm. Or, you know, a period, or, you know, which is an orbit of something around something. So all of our concepts of time involve cyclicality. And in the ancient world, people thought about not so much doing something new, different from their ancestors, but by doing it as well as their ancestors. You have a child, you found a city, You make peace, you declare war, you plant a crop, you get married, whatever you do, you're repeating something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was only in the modern times that we began, particularly the rise of the great monotheisms. Mm-hmm. To some extent with Judaism and also with Christianity and then Islam. And these monotheisms have become increasingly dominant over time. And then particularly, too, with the rise of Protestantism and the Renaissance, we began to think about time in a much more linear fashion. We're on an express train. Humanity is actually headed somewhere. Time started at year zero, and we're all headed to some destination.
There is a moment at which Jesus comes back. There is a point B that it ends at.
And you may be a post-millennial, you may be pre-millennial, you might have different theories about how it ends, but we are on a destination. And the rise of Hegelianism, the whole idea that history itself is moving progressively towards something. Again, this is all of a piece about how we think of it. But in the process of doing that, we're constantly frustrated because every time, we think things are going better and then they start going worse again, we wonder maybe if it's linear, maybe it's linear downward, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a constant frustration here. And I think that although they're obviously to some extent in history, I think particularly just, people often point to this, raw technological prowess, for example, our ability to do certain things with technology certainly is additive over time, although I must say there are certain periods in history in which we've lost it.
I know it was funny reading your book. I felt a little. I had a touch of. I blushed a little reading your book because at first you're talking about how you point out a moment ago that when monotheism comes about. There's this idea that there's a conclusion to history, and then it kind of goes, it's sort of, that declines a little bit, and the Reformation kicks in, and Protestants are like, now's the time, 1450, this is when Jesus comes back, and I'm chuckling going, ha, 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 silly religious people, and then you say, you sort of tie it into techno-optimism, and I guess I fall into that camp. I like Ray Kurzweil and that kind of thing, and one of the quotes I enjoyed was, the linear school views all human history as akin to a ski jump. After crouching dumbly for millennia, mankind is just now taking off on its glorious final flight. And then you mentioned that there's always kind of people in a generation that assume that they're the privileged ones that are at the moment of mankind's ultimate transformation. And I read that and went, I have a touch of that.
I mean, you go back, you look at the 1530s with the Munster rebellions, after Luther and they believe the same thing. The second coming is just about here. We've done it now. We have the Gutenberg Bible. Everyone can read it now. So suddenly we're on a whole new stage, and now it's the time. And in the 1840s with the Millerites, they were all on top of the roofs of their buildings throughout the Midwest. Waiting in their white robes. Waiting for the rapture.
But I, on the other hand, I am waiting for the singularity, which is very, very different than everything you're describing. Completely different.
And transhumanism has some eerie similarities.
Yeah.
In the sense of this total transformation, mm-hmm. and sort of a kind of a Gnostic idea that we will all be transformed into our essential being, which is all goodness and light,
mm-hmm.
Taken out of this corrupt world. But
yeah.
This idea of destination is something that is almost a disease of modernity, right? We all believe that we're just about there, and I think it's often consoling. Actually, it's not pessimistic. It's actually consoling to go back to a more cyclical view, in which every time things are going bad, we can, you look around the world today and people, find plenty to complain about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So instead of thinking that the linear is not suddenly linear or positive, but linear downward, no, it's part of a greater seasonality, and that we go through different periods in which we learn some things, unlearn others, but there's a broader rhythm or cycle at work. And we can rest assured that in the end, things will come out all right if we play our roles adequately, as individuals, as societies, as generations.
So, and what does that look like then? Because you've got, first of all, you've got the term seculum, which I had not heard before. What is a seculum?
Well, saeculum is, to anyone who used to go to Latin Mass knows, saeculum, saeculorum. It's an old Latin word meaning century, but it doesn't come from the word 100. Century comes from 100, centum, for that. It's rather a word that probably comes from Etruscan, and it originally meant a long human lifetime.
Okay.
So it is an unusual word, and Bill and I in our book adopted it actually as the essential governor of the timing of the cycle we talk about. We talk about a 4 generations, which in terms of birth years, each one is around 20, 22 years long, about the length of a phase of life, and that's that's a periodicity for generations, which is often used, and I think there's a lot to support it. Mm-hmm. But that 4 of those in a row makes about something like somewhere between 85, 90 years, and that's close to a century, and that's a long human life, and that these are periods which tend to govern a lot of societies in modern history, and even often in ancient world as well, in terms of the general timing of their kind of crisis turning points. And what we attempted to do, particularly in detail, and we did this in Fourth Turning. We had our earlier book called Generations, mm-hmm. It was kind of a generational retelling of all of American history from the 17th century onward. But this idea that not only in America but in much of the rest of the modern world, thinking about history with these turning points that are about 80 to 100 years apart, in terms of crisis turning points, in terms of periods or eras of specific eras of time in which we completely rebuild our civic life and all of our outer world of infrastructure, economy, politics, constitution, and the rest of that, and that roughly halfway in between those are the Great Awakenings, which are the sort of the periods of inner world makeover, when we remake the world of culture, ideas, religion, literature, and music, and all the rest. And if you look at American history, this has been a pattern which is widely sort of recognized by historians, that we've had these enormous civic turning points about, roughly every 80 or 90 years or so, right? I mean, going from the War of Spanish Succession, probably the first global war in Western history. It ended with the Glorious Revolution in Britain that sort of made it a world power, to the American Revolution, then the Civil War, then World War II and the Great Depression, and then we arrive at where we are today. And roughly halfway in between those are the Great Awakenings of American history. And in all of these cases, both the awakenings and the crises, they played a fundamental role in shaping, in both being driven by and shaping the young generation coming of age. In fact, they played sort of a turning point role in every generation alive at the time. But it's generations that are shaped young by history that then later in life go on as parents and as midlife leaders to shape history. Is the fundamental governor of this cycle, which is one of compensation and correction.
Okay, and so if I follow you, so there's 2 things that we've identified so far. There's generations that respond differently, and then there's also the sort of where we're at in the timeline of sort of seasonal national moods. And if I understand the kind of the mood cycle, there's a crisis point like World War II and the Great Depression. And that happens, we come together, we beat the terrible thing, and then there's a period afterwards where we're hunky-dory, and everybody kind of wants to be on the same page, and we agree that we all have the same ends in mind and that kind of thing. That goes on for some period of time, and then there's another generation that goes, actually, I find this kind of stifling, and I want to be me, and I disagree with the old institutions that we erected. They're flimsy and corrupt, and then that precipitates the next crisis, because we're we're now anxious and kind of coming apart, and then a crisis happens and brings us back together. Have I got that more or less right? Because I don't think I've fully grokked it yet, but I have read it.
Yeah, that's close. I would just make clear that each of these moods lasts an entire generation. In other words, a crisis era lasts a generation. So it lasts, 20, 25 years in which we have those turning points. In other words, the Great Depression and World War II occurred in a crisis era.
Okay.
And then we had the next era was sort of, the American high. This would have been the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when, during the crisis, that was when today's greatest generation was coming of age, right? The GI generation, the one that we think of as being a Promethean generation of builders and doers and community makers, right?
Okay.
And then the next era, which was the American high, so think of that as the winter, okay? So the next era, the American high, would have been the spring, and that's when the silent generation come of age. Those are people today in their late 70s, 80s, early 90s. That's the generation that remembers World War II as children,
Mm-hmm.
but were too young to actually participate in it.
Okay. Yeah.
We only have a few of those left, actually, in politics. We have, Mitch McConnell and Bernie Sanders, both born in 1942, both probably remember barely World War II as kids. But that generation is then, that's another location in history. And then the following period, which is when you said everybody gets dissatisfied, right, of all the conformity and all the social discipline, that becomes the awakening. And in America, that lasted from the mid-'60s to the early 1980s, right?
So that would be like Woodstock and hippies kind of rebelling against the conformity of the 50s?
Social and family experimentation, and of course, the generation coming of age.
Civil rights and things like that.
And those were boomers, yeah. And, civil rights started a little bit early in the late 50s.
Oh, I guess you're right, because that starts with Kennedy.
But certainly radicalized during the 60s. So I think of sort of the radical civil rights when it became, militant, right? As everything in the 60s, everything acquired an edge, right? Mm-hmm. And everything seemed to fall apart. And at the time, boomers thought that was a good idea. I mean, that was intentional, right? They thought their parents had built too much and that they were too construction-oriented and all these institutions are too strong. And boomers basically have become very comfortable with a less governed America, a less regulated America, a less taxed America, an America in which individuals are much more free to do whatever the hell they want. Widening inequality seems to be no real problem for most boomers, right? So, in other words, and that's typical of this kind of generation. We've seen them before in American history. And
before we get into the generations, can I backtrack a little bit just because I want to make sure that I've kind of got this rhythm down before we get into the archetypes. So if we were to back up to the beginning, because I think in your book you chart kind of the overall rhythm of the cycle. You pinpoint more or less to the Reformation, I believe, and then you focus on the Anglo-Saxon world. But within American history, presumably the crisis point would be the American Revolution. So we've become disenfranchised with colonial rule. The crisis point happens. There's, I guess, the era of good feelings. I think that's what comes next. And then maybe, I don't know what happens. Then probably the Spanish-American War is pretty popular, so that's the high again?
No. The after that era of good feelings is the Second Great Awakening.
Okay, right.
And that was the coming of age of the Transcendental generation, and that was an incredibly powerful generation of born again preachers and feminists and free thinkers and commune builders, and they built communes over much of New England and all the way under the Northwest Territories. That was the Blithedale Romance of Hawthorne. That was Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau, and Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Anyway, that was that generation, and they were a hellfire generation, and they did not compromise in anything. Mm-hmm. And Emerson famously said, coming of age, that in our childhood, and he was referring to the era of good feelings. That's when you were talking about that. Then in our childhood, there was nothing our parents said, not a conversation, not an essay, not a novel, not anything that was worth hearing. So very much like boomers, right? Thinking back to the 50s, right? There's just absolutely nothing going on that was worth even, paying attention to, right? We invented the culture afresh.
Okay.
And that was a very powerful generation in the culture. And ultimately, when they got to midlife, they led the nation right into the Civil War, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was their legacy.
And that is I assume that is the big crisis point in that seculum is the Civil War.
I think you could say that it.
I'm just making sure I've got it. That would seem to be the big.
I think you'd say that in fatalities per capita and a fundamental reshaping of our Constitution. Yes.
Yeah. We've got the Civil War, and then after the Civil, I wouldn't think of Reconstruction as a really balmy fun time, but at some point we get this kind of pleasant, It was what's sometimes called the Victorian high of sort of prosperity and industrial progress. Enormous investment, large rise, annual growth in standard of living. And you're right, it was not necessarily often periods of high unemployment, periods of deflation. It was certainly tough on agriculture. It's tough all over the world for agriculture back then. But ultimately, that issued into the next awakening, which is often called the Third Great Awakening, which is in the 1890s, which is also the birth of modernism. And that was William Jennings Bryan, and that was the rise of the populist movement, and ultimately issued into the progressive movement after 1900. And that was our next awakening. And then we had, then another unraveling, sort of that fall season. In the 1920s, that was the Roaring 20s, after World War I, and then ultimately we went back into crisis again with the Great Crash. Okay.
And so you get the idea. You sort of have the summer season would be the awakenings, and the fall season, which we haven't really talked about. These are periods which are the opposite of the spring, obviously. During the spring, everyone sort of prizes social solidarity, and everyone's building huge monuments to the crisis they just went through.
Yeah.
And by the way, back in the 1870s and 1880s, almost every big city in the North were building these massive Civil War monuments. Mm-hmm. So everyone was looking up, thinking, "Oh my
good job, everybody! High fives all around. Well done, team."
Exactly. Yeah, we did this huge thing, right? And anyway, but in an unraveling. It's the opposite. Institutions are discredited. Individualism is strong, and the country is what we might call lightly governed. So, good examples of what we call third turning decades would be the 1850s. Before the Civil War, when that was when the transcendental generation was just really doing whatever the hell it wanted to. The 1920s. Famously, right? That was the Roaring 20s, gin fizz crowd and
kind of great Gatsby, Prohibition, great time. People in tuxes drinking cocktails.
And these are often decades with enormous, financial bubbles, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because individualism kind of runs rampant. And then the 1990s, early OLs, definitely another example of what we call the fall turning season.
Okay.
And typically. And then you're right. Then you kind of go into the winter, and that's kind of how the year, that's how the year renews itself.
Okay.
Each of these seasons is associated with another generation coming of age, another generation moving into midlife, and so forth.
Right, and this is we can get into the generations now because I find this really interesting. So I was born in '84. I'm like I describe myself as a fifth-year millennial. Like I'm a millennial, but you can't get much older than I am before you hit Gen X. But I came of age where early on I remember I vaguely remember the Soviet Union falling apart, but I do remember in middle school having this great period where we were like, hey, we won. Like, everybody's our friend now. Russia's our friend. The Kidder Accords happened, so we're friends with the Klingon Empire. Like, everybody agrees that democracy and capitalism are great. And then 9/11 happens. And then after 9/11 happens, so that's a formative event for me in high school. And then I get through college, and then about a year after I graduate college, the Great Recession happens. And I assume that's a different phenomenon for me in my generation than someone that grows up where the economy's booming right out of the gate.
Well, different and the same. I mean, it means something different to you than other generations, right? Particularly those who have seen something similar to it before. I mean, one thing about defeating communism is that it really gave rise to this, the Washington Consensus, the rise of neoliberalism, the deregulatory tax cut state, and the idea. You remember Francis Fukuyama published that book.
History was over.
The end of history.
Yeah.
Talking about linearism, right? There's your linear history right there. And that nation states were going to fade away, and we're all just going to become individuals. We wouldn't even have jobs anymore. We would just contract with each other to make money when we felt like it. And we would be. It was kind of going to be this sort of libertarian paradigm.
I was about to say, I have many friends that are hoping for just that outcome.
History didn't turn out that way.
We haven't gotten to that point. We deregulated the airlines in the late 70s. We kind of thought it would just keep going. No. So what? Yeah, tell me. So we've got the cycle down now. What are the archetypical generations that are playing out inside of it?
So each, and there's certain patterns here. And let me just say, when Bill and I first wrote, I just should preface this by saying, when Bill and I first wrote Generations, we weren't even looking for a cycle. We were just fascinated with the differences in generations and their impact on American history. Mm-hmm. And when we went back all the way several centuries and started writing this thing, we noticed that not only were they very different from each other, with a very different collective sense of self-awareness. And this goes way back. I mean, this is long before boomers and Xers and all that. I mean, this is back in the 17th century. But not only are they very different, but that these differences arrived in a pattern, right? And that certain kinds of generations always tend to follow other kinds of generations. And it absolutely fascinated us. And then when we found that it was kind of aligned to history itself, as it kind of had to be when you think about it, that kind of led us to an idea which we fully explored in the fourth turning, which is the whole idea of generational archetypes, meaning that you belong to an archetype, right? A certain kind of generation because of your location in history. So, for example, generations that are born just after crises, when, raising of kids becomes increasingly indulgent, and you're this period of relative peace and prosperity, and institutions are working fine. This is what we call a prophet archetype, and boomers are a good example of it, right? They're raised in that period, kind of the Leave It to Beaver kind of upbringing. Yeah. Then coming of age, this generation always spearheads the next Great Awakening, right? They always then launch a full-headed kind of values and cultural assault on everything their parents built. So right? with the boomers,
they're growing up and Leave It to Beaver, but then they kick off Woodstock. So they're the kids. They're the kids in I can't remember the name of the town that Andy Griffith's in, but Mayberry. They're the kids in Mayberry, and then they when they hit 16, they start smoking pot, and they get into transcendentalism or something else, and they're rebelling against the old order.
And they become defiant, and I think to the absolute surprise, shock, and horror of older generations at the time. So that then is a surprise. They basically reshape and remake the culture. And one thing about boomers is that they really successfully did that. If you pick up any cultural artifact in the 20th century, if you couldn't tell anything else about it, you could probably tell whether it was made before or after the late 60s, right?
Yeah.
just everything's different. It's almost like going from black and white to color. It's just the feel of it changes. Well, okay, so they're very successful at that. Then they go on at individualizing society, both in the culture and the economy. And in boomers' cases, they started individualizing the culture and deregulating the culture, and then eventually they deregulated the economy. And then in every time, this kind of generation entering old age as senior leaders takes the nation into and through the next great crisis. that's happened every time with this kind of generation. In fact, every crisis we've had has had as its senior leaders that type of generation. You think of FDR and Stimson and, Ickes and, the kind of the wise old men of the late 1930s. They were all coming of age during the Second Great Awakening. Abraham Lincoln and, his generation came of age during the Second Great Awakening. Anyway, you go back and you see that pattern. Now, at the other end of the cycle, what we call the hero archetype, these are kids raised just after the awakening, right? That would be people like you, Andrew. We're talking about millennials.
I'm liking this so far. I like how you're identifying me.
All right, there you go. Well, I'm trying to bring out the inner you, that archetypal you. So reach down, Andrew. Come on, reach down. But anyway, so they have no memory of the awakening. You're right. They everything is becoming increasingly protective. Characteristic of this kind of generation, there's a moral panic over kids, right? Everyone wants to protect them more. They want more structure. They want more, they want more safety, more protection, more sense of mission, dressing them more in uniforms. Anyway, that's a characteristic pattern, and we've certainly seen that with millennials. Millennials then come of age at some point before they have, fully entered young adulthood. So before this generation is, from their early 20s to their mid 40s, which for millennials is, still leaves another 10 years to go, they will take America, they will complete America's passage through the next crisis, which we think has already happened. I mean, I think we've already entered the era, right?
Okay. Yeah.
The crisis era. And then later in life, this kind of generation is greeted by a cultural awakening, a spiritual awakening fired by the young. So their own kids will, and you can just see it with millennials with all of their, digital optimization, leaving everything up to Google and their huge emphasis on community and so on. You can just see once that fully gets locked into place, and once we got cameras on everyone and everyone knows what everyone's doing and everyone is completely, everyone gets out of line and they get flamed and called out on social media. You can imagine that kind of culture that millennials will finally establish. You can just imagine how their own kids.
Yeah, I could see that because a couple of thoughts on everything you just said. I want to unpack a little bit. I'm slightly critical of the idea that we're that affected by our generation in that, in say referencing presidents and things like that. I suspect that ideology is a more significant factor in outcome than birth order is. Or to put it another way, I think that I probably am more similar to other people in other generations, say politically, depending on what their orientation is, than I am necessarily to other millennials. That said, though, I think you're very right on two counts. One, I think the idea that we compensate for the excesses of our parents is probably very accurate when it comes to parenting specifically. Like, so I'm 35. My friends and I have this we're kind of looking around going, wow, maybe helicopter parenting's gone too far. And I feel like there's kind of a burgeoning consensus that might be okay to let kids go down to the creek. They don't have to have an ankle bracelet on them. So I suspect that the kids that were raised with ankle bracelets are probably going to let their kids run roughshod. I'm kind of in the middle. And then the kids that run roughshod will conversely, 100 years from now, they're going to have their kids will have cyborg nannies or whatever. Then the other thing is that when it comes to kind of the cultural values, it's funny. Like I'm very much a free market guy, and I'm not a big government guy at all. That said, though, I am deeply, deeply concerned about America being alienated and disconnected. I think it's a very lonely time in American history, and so I'm very concerned with community building and consensus and trying to get people all to come together, which I guess is a hallmark of millennials.
Yes, and I find that actually extends across partisan divisions. I did a survey back in 2014 for the Congressional Institute. It's basically they serve the Republican Party in Congress, and they just asked me to do it. We did this big thing, and I presented it to all the members of Congress. I think it was back in Hershey, Pennsylvania, a couple of years ago. And the most telling question we asked this of all generations on our sample size of maybe a couple thousand. But the most telling question we asked all generations was this, and that was, what would you favor most? As for what do you support most? Your idea of government, and two ideas of government. One was government should reinforce the principle of self-reliance, or government should reinforce the principle of community. There was a 30 percentage point divide between 50 over and 35 minus, right? In other words, age-wise, right? On that question. And this is what's interesting, Andrew, that it was the biggest divide among Democrats as among Republicans, meaning that just among Republicans, there was a 35% divide on that question, right?
Okay.
So that is what I'm talking about generational differences actually transcending or crossing these partisan lines. On your next question about free-range kids, it's fascinating, and I often get asked that. Lenore Skenazy actually came out with that book.
Oh, yeah, I know Lenore, yeah.
She's a lightweight boomer, and she came out with that book about how, kids are being incarcerated today, and they're accosted, they can't breathe, and they're being surveilled all the time by their parents. And you're absolutely right. There will be a reaction to it, and it will be led by millennials, but not yet.
Okay.
We find typically what happens is that the current generation, this post-millennial generation we're raising now, will be very protected, right? They'll be like the silent generation.
Okay, yeah.
It will be the generation after them. So it's basically, particularly late-wave millennials raising their older kids. They'll be the ones that kind of begin to really let go. And so I think that it's something that will take some time to mature. Right now, child-raising trends are really being governed still by Generation X. And Xers are in total reaction to how they were raised. I mean, Xers were the ultimate throwaway kids. No one paid them any attention. People took pills not to have them. I mean, they were just...
The baby boomers were off finding themselves. Or I guess, the baby boomers wouldn't have been their parents, would it?
No, so each generation, if you think of each generation born over about 20 years or so, it's really given birth to by the previous two generations in almost equal amounts. So both the silent generation and the boomers kind of gave birth to Gen X.
Okay.
You'd say most of the Gen Xers born in the 1960s had silent generation parents. Most of the Gen Xers born in the 1970s had boomer parents. But they were left totally on their own, and that's one of the reasons why Gen Xers are such resilient libertarians. I mean, they don't expect anyone to do anything for them. They live their life on their own.
It's funny, whenever I think of Gen X, I think of my old boss Kennedy at Fox Business, who is also very libertarian. So it's funny that you would ping that immediately, because that's my immediate mental representation is both of those things for Gen X.
Well, and politically, the early wave of Gen X, born in the early 60s, mainly born in the 1960s, they came of age with Reagan. And they not only tend to be libertarian, but they voted for their life very strongly Republican. And one of the things you saw in the 1986 presidential primaries, right, which is an open primary, right? Obama was leaving, so both the Republicans and the Democrats had to come up with a new candidate, right? And so think about this: how many Xers were running for candidate on the Republican side versus the Democratic side? You had about 12 Gen Xers run on the Republican side. Bobby Jindal and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, and you just go down the list. I mean, a whole bunch of almost no one on the Democratic side. And part of that is the test of the fact that these people born in the 60s, which are now just coming online as kind of, presidential age, you know what I mean? Presidential age. They tend to be a little bit lopsided in terms of their partisan orientation, also just their sort of ideological bent. Even those who are Democrats tend to be somewhat, libertarian. So anyway, that's the group now, and they absolutely want to smother their kids. So, and I talk a lot to these parents, and it's not just subconscious. They will very deliberately say, I'm raising my kid like this precisely as they will not have the experience I had. So all of those, chips in their backpacks and and ankle bracelets and those little geofences and their cell phones and all the rest of the stuff. That's all a sign of love, right? Gen X parents.
All right. Well, I'll give him a pass then. So before we finish up, I want to go back because in reading your book, I was struggling to figure out where we were in the cycle that you described, and it seemed to me that it was really interesting to read. By the way, I'll read a quote from the book because I think did it come out in '97? The fourth turning.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, keep in mind, this is from 1997. It says, the next fourth turning is due to begin shortly after the new millennium, midway through the 00 decade, or the 00 decade. Around the year 2005, a sudden spark will catalyze a crisis mood. Remnants of the old social order will disintegrate. Political and economic trust will implode. And I thought about that, and there is something evergreen about predicting, that there will be a crisis in 20 years. That's a pretty standard, a pretty good thing to do. But then I did think about it, and I was like, well, we had in 2001 we have 9/11, and then a few years later we have the economic crisis, and that's about midpoint there. So within the cycle system that you have, I guess the 90s would be the awakening. That's where we're getting more individualistic. It's Wall Street. No, okay.
90s were the unraveling. So that
gotcha. Okay.
That follows the awakening.
Right.
So
okay. Yes. Okay.
You got a whole nother generation in there.
Okay. So
you have to have a whole period for Gen X to come of age. Okay.
So that's the unraveling. So where are we at in this cycle? Are we smack dab in? I think you said the crisis has already happened. So it feels like we're in a kind of nasty winter right now emotionally to me. It doesn't seem like we're in a good national mood. So is this like the last cold snap before the spring, or are we dead in the middle of it? Where would you put us?
No, we're kind of in the middle of it, and obviously most of the real kind of reconstruction has yet to occur. So I think, we entered it, if you're looking for dates, I would say 2008, 2009 with the GFC. I mean, the biggest downturn since 29, right, in the global economy. And in so many ways, the mood in the decades since then, in so many ways parallels the 30s, right? If you just think about the whole new talk about secular stagnation and debt deflation and, inequality and the whole problem with wages and trust in leaders, the rebirth of populism, both on the right and the left. And I think, too, geopolitically, because this isn't just anymore America. These generational trends are certainly at work in Europe and through much of Southeast Asia. So, in other words, you look around the world today, what did we see in the 30s? Well, people were repudiating international alliances. Remember, the League of Nations was sort of falling into disuse. And authoritarian leaders, new strongmen, were doing what the hell they wanted in their region of the world. And the authoritarian model was beginning to gain a new prestige in the 1930s, both on the left and the right. Remember, on the left, there was Stalin. There was the miracles that were being done in the new Soviet Union.
And then there was also the idea that fascism was an alternative to the excesses of capitalism and communism. It was just will and intelligence, and that was popping up.
Hayek used to say, when he was he spent 1930s in England, but he used to say that, and he was a member of the lost generation. He was already in his 50s by then. But he used to say, of all the young men who were coming from America and going to the continent, he said they all came back either communists or fascists, but none of them came back as liberal moderates. So anyway, that was the 1930s, right? And I think you look too at the renaissance of extended family living, multiple generations, in a house. You think of all those Frank Capra films of the 1930s, right? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. You can't take it with you. I mean, all these different families living in one Victorian home. Well, it's come back, right? Now it's the McMansion, and it's millennials still living with their parents, ex-parents. So we see a lot of these problems, too, of sort of generational mobility and a pessimism about, whether or not the whole political economy, as it's now constituted, has any future. I think that there are grave forebodings, particularly with young people, about whether or not this kind of liberal democratic order that most of the developed world, embraces, really works for them. I mean, it doesn't seem to be investing in them. It seems to be doing nothing to prepare for their future. So why not, think about, I don't know,
sliding into statism or finding an authoritarian. Yeah.
Well, I mean, these are say what you will. These are societies which save and invest, 40-45% of their GDP in the future. What the hell do? We just have bigger and bigger unfunded liabilities and debt. We pay for old people their benefits, and we require young people to, pay for their own college education and all the rest. So I think that we have some huge issues with this era of kind of creative destruction, which really started with Trump, and has more time to go. I was very interested to see just yesterday in the Washington Post an article about how 12% of Sanders voters voted for Trump. So
really, okay, yeah. Well, populist overlap.
So,
I guess that makes sense.
Well, it is, and that is the nexus of a populist party, right? And that's why Sanders actually went out of his way to go on Fox News and spend an hour being interviewed. I think Bernie Sanders knows exactly where a lot of his potential voters are. They're on the populist right.
Yeah.
And they certainly haven't seen much to excite them in what the Donald has done. So I do think that the rise of populism and authoritarianism is a hallmark of our age right now. It's going to come up big time in the 2020 election. I mean, all of the Democratic candidates are getting on board. It's coming up in Europe, and it's coming up in Asia. So these are the things that are going to steepen, trends that are going to steepen before they flatten out.
Okay, so final question for you. It sounds like we're in the thick of the crisis period. For those of us that are in it, which is everybody listening to the podcast, what's your advice on how to rise to the occasion?
Well, first of all, as Bob Dylan used to say, just be aware of which way the wind's blowing, right? Mm-hmm. You don't need a extravagant forecast to realize that we haven't yet been through the worst of it. Mm-hmm. You will know that we're through the worst of it when people begin to settle on some new nexus of social authority. That is to say, a new source of common civic membership begins to arise. And typically that happens with the birth of a leader, a movement. One party begins to dominate. That's certainly what happened, in the Civil War. Obviously, the Republican Party just took over everything. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party basically ran America, for the next 70 years after the Civil War. Yeah. With a brief interruption of Woodrow Wilson. But and think of what the Democratic Party did in the New Deal. Think of what the Federalist Democrats, did with all those Virginian presidencies after the American Revolution. So typically you have something approaching a one-party government, or at the very least, a government in which there's an enormous consensus of all kinds of things that has to be done. And that is usually established well before the crisis is over. In fact, it's established in order to overcome the crisis, right? This is why I think that we have not seen all that we're going to see. We have to see a lot more change in policy. I think the Democratic Party is both a symptom and ultimately will be a motivator of that kind of period of rapid change. I think everyone realizes the Democrats now are completely outside the box, right? Mm-hmm. In the sense of sort of radical proposals. I mean, anything from universal benefits to, single payer health care to Green New Deal. AOC is just totally into this crisis rhetoric, right? Mm-hmm. With regard to the Green New Deal, we're going to have, labor battalions for the next 10 years, overhauling America's infrastructure and so forth. I mean, I don't know how she's going to do that without national service, but yeah. I think increasingly the Democrats are kind of getting into that. And it will be interesting to see how this nation responds.
Well, Mr. Howe, I have had a blast talking to you. Thank you for coming on the program.
You're welcome.
A little bit of listener feedback before we wrap up for today. On iTunes, Razilian 2.0 says, Water brother Andrew Jubal Heaton Esquire speaks rightly. I do not always grok in fullness, but I am only an egg. Share water, never thirst. What a great Heinlein review. I give your review 5 stars. You can watch this whole show on YouTube. If you look for Something Off with Andrew Heaton, you can see my handsome bearded face and an assortment of snazzy waistcoats like the red one I am wearing today, and you can look at the dead bison we screwed up on the wall. Watching Something's Off with Andrew Heaton on your computer will make you seem more sophisticated and amusing. It will also give you a low-level dose of telepathy, which you can, admittedly, be problematic with in the workplace, but can also ensure your eventual rise to power if you use it correctly. So go to YouTube and start watching full episodes. I look like the kind of guy Rudy Giuliani was trying to protect when he implemented stop and frisk in New York City. That's probably true. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton or Facebook me at facebook.com/Mighty Heaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter at mightyheaton.com and just replying when I send it out on Fridays, or to the welcome email. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. That helps other people discover this here political orphanage.